If you want to dominate the map, you need to understand it. Knowing which areas are safe and which ones are risky is a crucial part of that understanding. Being able to decide where to look and where to turn your back is going to play a huge role in your survivability and performance. Being able to work the lanes and geometry in your favor is a big step into controlling the game. But a misstep in either of these areas is a recipe for failure. So in this video, you're going to learn how to boost your KD by making sure you're doing this right, and you're not dying to this super common mistake. What's up everyone, I am Godin Gaming, and today we're going to learn how to limit your exposure. So, what is exposure? Exposure is referring to how much of your character is open to being shot. So if you're standing in the open in the middle of the map, your exposure is extremely high. If you're in an area with good cover, inside a bubble, behind a barricade and an ice wall, well, GG's, your exposure is very low. Having high exposure is obviously very bad since you're making it easier for the enemy to land a shot on you. So it's naturally harder to survive when you have high exposure. Not only that, if your exposure is high, it also means the enemy doesn't need that much map control since now they don't have to move to certain lanes to get an angle on you. But having low exposure has just the opposite effect. It makes it harder for the enemy to land a shot on you, which is obviously good since it increases your survivability and therefore pressures them to gain map control. So, high exposure is risky, therefore bad, and low exposure is safe, therefore good. Obviously, we want to minimize the amount of needless risks we take to maximize our survivability. This is the main reason you should want to limit your exposure. To learn how to do that, I'm going to show you this step-by-step guide to limit your exposure. But if you want to get the most out of this, you should watch until the end where I explain how to really use and implement everything in the video, which will fast track your improvement. But for now, let's get started with the first step. Find cover. This one is super obvious, and frankly, it should come as no surprise if you've seen my lane next to cover video. If anything, this video is the next evolution of that concept, so it'll be helpful if you already know what's in there. Link below if you want to watch that first. But the basic premise is that we should be looking to be near cover most of the time, especially during our engagements. So, during your first bit of practice for today, just remember to constantly remind yourself to find cover. Just repeat it over and over. Before and after each fight, every time you die, ask yourself, was I near cover? After you're finding yourself near cover most of the time, you can move on to step 2. Use your cover. Here, we want to make sure that you're not only fighting near cover, but you're also using your cover. It's not enough to simply have cover near you, because if you're not using that cover to do anything, you're not limiting your exposure, and it's basically a wasted tool. Using it properly, though, can give you a substantial advantage. So let's learn how to use your cover. Use your cover refers to these two main aspects: peek shooting and recovery. Peek shooting is common among most, if not all, FPS games. It's a simple yet effective way of limiting your exposure and therefore giving you the edge over anyone not doing it. It is a must if you want to learn how to limit your exposure. To do this, you simply expose yourself out of cover to take a shot or two, then return back into cover. Emphasis on slightly exposing yourself because you don't always want to reveal your full character model, as this makes it easier for the enemies to hit you, and it makes the time and distance to go back into cover a little bit larger. Ideally, you're doing this with a high impact gun like a hand cannon, snipers, bows, etc. Although you can still do this with things like auto rifles, you just won't see as strong of a benefit. After you've taken these first few shots and you've moved into your cover, you just repeat the process at your own pace. Some people might say it's better to stay in the lane and aim down sights because you have a better chance of being ready, but the truth is the person moving out of cover has a certain amount of peekers advantage. If you want to know what that is, my buddy Castle made a great video explaining that, and I'll just leave that link below as well. But anyway, peek shooting allows you to dictate the pace of the fight, and when you're back into your cover, it allows you to gauge the situation. Did you do more damage, or did you take more damage? Are you better off after those shots, or is the enemy? If it makes the enemy a little bit better off, then you move on to the second aspect of using your cover: recovery. This is exactly as it sounds. If you're weak, or you were losing that gunfight, you simply stay behind your cover and wait for your health to return. If they didn't rush you or use an ability, then after a few seconds you'll both be at full HP and the fight resets. High recovery is super helpful here, by the way, so you should probably try to do that. Having the fight reset is obviously good for you if you were losing that fight, and there's absolutely no judgment for doing this. Don't feel like a failure or you lost just because you have to wait to recover. It's often the best play. But they could use a nade to damage you when you return to cover, so you do need to watch out for that. One tip is to back up a little bit from your cover, as that's a prime finishing nade spot. They could also try to rush you, which does give you a slight advantage since they have no cover while pushing and therefore high exposure. And you can see them coming with radar, so you do get to dictate the pace of that fight as well to a certain degree. But if you get hit for a lot of damage by that nade, or you don't think you can stop the push, then you move on to the next part of limiting your exposure. Know you're out. This one might seem obvious at first, but there are a few things we need to keep in mind. If you're heavily outnumbered, or you know abilities are coming, or a heavy push, then you need to get out. And because you're using your cover, you should have a path that leads to safety. That is your out. And you should always know you're out. This means that at any point in time, you know the safest path that can lead you away from your current position if things get too dicey. To have a proper out, you're going to want to use major cover instead of minor cover. Minor cover is something like a box or a single pillar. It's just a small object on the map where even if you're behind it, someone can easily find a shot on you with minimal movement and time. If the enemy can simply jump up and take a shot on you, it's minor cover. If they can take one slide to the right and shoot you, it's also minor cover. Major cover is something that is quite large, or even just a big wall. And it's difficult to find a sightline on you when you go back into cover. Major cover doesn't leave you easily exposed when you try to take your out. And that's why you should prefer major cover. The best out will always have the most amount of teammates, the least amount of enemies, and the least amount of exposure. So, if you know there's a path that has allies in it, with no enemies and lots of closed off cover, then that is probably your best out. Moving towards your own spawn is often the best out, as it can have all three. Moving towards the mid can sometimes be the best out, and moving towards the enemy spawn is often the worst out. But to properly know your out, you need to be constantly refreshing it in your mind. Destiny is a fast game, and things can change quickly, so you need to read the radar because a lane you might have thought that was clear a second ago might not be anymore. Or your original spawn might have swapped, or your allies might have died, etc. So after you've been finding and using your cover, you should always be asking yourself, what is my out? So that covers a lot of the defensive ways we should be thinking about the map and our exposure, but let's talk about how it can help us strategically choose and win engagements. We're going to do that with our next step, slice the pie. Slicing the pie is a way of increasing your survivability by limiting your exposure when rounding the corner or moving out of cover. It does so by ensuring you only expose yourself to the fewest amount of lanes or enemies at any time. Basically, instead of moving out of your cover and looking at all the possible lanes in front of you at the same time, you'll instead clear each likely enemy location or lane one at a time, moving from the outside in. So if you're going to peek out and your cover is on your right, clearing outside first would mean that you look at the leftmost lane, clear that, then move on to the one to the right of it, etc, etc. If your cover is on your left, clearing outside in would mean looking at the rightmost lane and then moving to the one left of that, etc, etc. I could go on and on about this one, but my buddy Pattycakes made a great video and I would just seriously watch it because it's a really important concept and he did a stellar job. That and my videos usually get too long, so thank you, Patty. Anyway, now you just have to remember that when you're about to peek a lane that you should slice the pie. Actually, there is one more thing I wanted to mention about slicing the pie. Your forward engagements, i.e. the fights in front of you, are better for you when you're further away from your cover, at least in terms of forward distance from your cover. I don't want to get bogged down in the details, but essentially the closer you are to cover, the more exposed your body becomes when you try to peek out. So it might not always be a great idea to be super hugging your cover, but you also need to keep in mind that if you back up too far away from that cover, it often exposes you to an entirely different lane from the side or back. It's a sort of balance you'll have to find. To get the most out of it, you'll have to learn how to limit your sightlines. Sightlines are just that, a line of sight. If the enemy can see you, it's a sightline. Could also be called a lane as well. And if you want to limit your exposure, you should obviously want to limit your sightlines. But the problem is that at any point in time, you are going to be visible to more than one sightline. Obviously that's an issue since we can only really cover about a 90-degree angle in front of us, which would ideally be even smaller. The trick here is to choose the areas of the map that expose you to the least amount of lanes. If you're looking for an area with only a few sightlines, knowing the map is obviously going to be a big help for that. So when you're practicing, you should be trying to find and fight in areas that can limit your sightlines. If the area you're in is open to 7 or 8 lanes, then that's probably not a good spot. You should be looking for spots that can only kind of expose you to like 3, maybe 4 lanes. So when you are trying to limit your sightlines in your practice, you should ask yourself, how many sightlines am I open to? There's also one more way we can limit your sightlines and your exposure, and it has to do with your teammates. We're going to talk about that next, but do remember to stay to the end if you really want to learn how to use this guide to boost your KD. Anyway, on to the last tip. Know the flow. If you really want to dominate the map, you need to understand the flow. Like we've talked about before, you do want to limit your sightlines. And again, this means you want to be exposed to as few lanes as possible. So obviously you want to choose cover that will help you do that. But thinking about cover like this is kind of static. AKA, this spot always has the fewest amount of exposed sightlines. But the game isn't some rigid structure. It's fluid. People are moving all over the map fairly quickly, and things can change on a dime. So while yes, it is advantageous to choose cover that can only expose you to a few lanes, but that doesn't deal with the varied nature of combat. Some lanes are more dangerous, not based on the amount of sightlines, but also based on where the action is. Picture this. If you're in a lane that is open to a lot of sightlines, but most of those are being held by your allies, is that a dangerous area? Well, not for the moment. And likewise, if you're in a lane that has very few sightlines, but all have red blips on the radar, is that still a safe area? Again, not really for the moment. I have a little side note here. If you're about to go into a lane and it's too far for the radar to read, or you're not sure if the enemy is there, you should just assume they are, because that will probably save you a lot of deaths in the future. Anyway, the idea here is that we need to use the position of your allies and your enemies to decide which sightlines you're willing to expose yourself to. Because remember, at any point in time, you are open to being shot from somewhere that you're not looking. But if we know the flow of the map, you can use that to lower your exposure. So if you're at an area that has multiple sightlines, but you notice that most of those are covered by your teammates, that could still be considered a safe area. If you know the flow of the map, you can use that to lower your exposure. You can decide which lanes to look at and which you can turn your back to. This is arguably the most difficult part and concept of the video because it requires constant adjustment. So make sure to practice this last. Once you've practiced all these, you can now break the rules. There are obviously times you can break these rules, like pushing a 3v1 or the enemy's weak, you have a nade chasing him, etc. But it's always better to learn the rules first so that you can learn how to break them. And I feel the same way about risk. High risk, high reward is a thing, and it's definitely a strong playstyle. And you'll get there, but just like with rules, you need to learn how to avoid risk first so that you can learn how to take them later. So don't feel the need to rush through the process. Trust me, it does work. Now, on to the final concept that will help you improve more than anything. How to use this guide. Listen, I know it is easy to watch a video and feel like you've learned something or that you've improved. It happens with some of my students. They say they're going to remember how to do something or remember to practice. I'll even tell them in the lesson to play something for me, but just play one part a little bit softer. And you would think they do it right because I just told them, but they can often still just easily miss it. This is because deliberate practice and improvement is really hard to achieve, probably even for you. I mean, just test yourself right now. Do you remember the 7 ideas from this video that we just talked about? It's very tempting for me to summarize it for you, but testing is one of the best ways to remember something, and frankly, I don't really want to rob you of that opportunity. But do comment below letting me know how many you did remember, or if you got them all. But anyway, if you want to get the most out of this guide, you need to take the step-by-step idea seriously. So that means after you've watched this video, you should take the first idea and practice that for a bit, then move on to the next one, and so on and so forth. Yes, that's right, I did say practice. Because just like anything else, this is a skill and it should be practice. Learning every tip and trick in the book isn't going to help you if you don't put it into practice. As a piano teacher, I can confidently say there is nothing that will help you improve more than learning how to use deliberate practice. It's why I've dedicated an entire video to that. So if you want to learn the fastest way to improve and you really want to learn how to maximize your time and energy, you should check that out. So when you are practicing, make sure you are constantly reminding yourself of your goal for that session. It is extremely easy to derail yourself and go on autopilot mode, trust me. So you should use a sticky note or a notepad or whatever. Use anything at your disposal to remember what specific skills you are working on. We are trying to train your autopilot, and that happens one step at a time. The reason we practice one step at a time like this is that it's basically the best way to learn something. Learning any new skill is simply a process of learning a new technique or idea and layering that on top of your current base or understanding. You have to crawl before you can walk, and you have to walk before you can run. I know it sounds cheesy, but it absolutely just works. The goal with these types of guides is to broaden and deepen your understanding with small digestible steps, while slowly helping you get a better idea of the larger picture. This type of learning or skill acquisition is called proceduralization and composition. If you'd like to know more about the technicality of that, there's also a video of that below. Hopefully now you understand why and how you should limit your exposure. Everything in here is meant to boost your survivability and by extension your KD. But being able to survive longer also has a side benefit. Every engagement has the potential to teach you something. And if you limit your exposure and you're dying less, then you'll be able to have more of those teachable moments. So, in your practice sessions, remember to limit your exposure. Anyway, that's going to do it for the video. Hopefully you found that valuable. If you did, please hit that like button and feel free to subscribe as well, because that tells me I'm doing something right. Anyway, I appreciate you all taking the time, and if you've made it to the end of the video, happy practicing.